This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the podcast giving voices back to victims of child abuse murder and their families. I'm your host, Laine, and this is episode 167, Childhood Torture with Allie Davis. On this podcast, I've told you the stories of many children whose deaths came at the hands of parents or guardians after extended periods of what can only be described as torture. Intra-familial child torture is a disturbingly common occurrence, and it has a 36% fatality rate for the children affected. In this episode, you'll hear my conversation with childhood torture survivor and advocate Allie Davis. Allie survived 19 years of torture at the hands of one of her parents. Her experience led her to create the Pretty Graffiti Foundation to fund humanitarian aid for survivors of non-war-related childhood torture in the U.S. This is the inspiring story of Allie Davis and the Pretty Graffiti Foundation. There's currently no medical definition of torture as a form of child abuse or intrafamilial child torture. A 2014 study called Child Torture as a Form of Child Abuse in the Journal of Child and Adolescent Trauma discussed the topic and suggested defining child torture as a longitudinal experience characterized by at least 2 physical assaults or 1 extended assault, 2 or more forms of psychological maltreatment, and neglect resulting in prolonged suffering, permanent disfigurement or dysfunction, or death. I took a quick glance through the names of the kids I've covered on this podcast whose treatment would qualify as torture under that definition, and I can't even begin to believe how many of them fit the criteria, starting with AJ Frund, age 5, whose story I covered in episodes 1, 22, and more recently, mega episode 123. AJ's drug-addicted, narcissistic mother, Joanne Cunningham, assaulted him regularly. She punished him with cold showers and kept him locked inside his bedroom with just a toddler potty. Joanne beat AJ to death with the shower head before AJ's father, Andrew Frund Sr., buried him in a shallow grave. Zymir Perkins was 6 when he died as the result of a brutal beating from his mother's boyfriend, Raisheem Smith, who hung Zymir from a hook on the bathroom door and beat him with a shower curtain rod. Raisheem often punished Zymir by forcing him to exercise, depriving him of food, beating him, and making him stay awake and standing all night. At 8 years old, Raylee Browning was supposedly homeschooled by her father, Marty Browning, his wife, Julie Tichenel Browning, and her sister, Sherry Tichenel. The 3 withheld food and water from Raylee as punishment. They forced her to take prescription medication for behavioral disorders she didn't have. They abused Raylee physically, mentally, and verbally. In December of 2018, Raylee came down with pneumonia, and they refused her medical treatment until Raylee's body became septic, and she died. Thomas Valva was also 8 when he died. Tommy was on the autism spectrum, as was his older brother, Anthony. Their father, Michael Valva, and his fiancée, Angela Polina, withheld food from the boys, sent them to school in urine-stained clothing, beat them often, and forced them to sleep in their family's unheated garage in the wintertime with no blankets or anything to sleep on. Tommy died from hypothermia in January 2020. After Alex Hurley's father died, he went to live with his father's family, including his paternal grandmother, her husband, and their children. 4 family members participated in Alex's 2-year torture, which included frequent beatings, food withheld as punishment, being forced to stand in his underwear in front of a fan, sleep deprivation, and more. 12-year-old Alex died after a particularly severe beating by his 14-year-old uncle caused a fatal head injury. Amy Deal also lived with her father and his family, many of whom participated in her torture. In fact, after 11-year-old Amy died, 5 members of the family were convicted of her abuse and murder. They forced Amy to sleep in a shower stall, refused her food but gave it to other children, beat her repeatedly, and used a small plastic footlocker as punishment. The night Amy died, her cousin and her husband forced Amy to climb into the footlocker, padlocked it shut, and left her to suffocate to death. Just for perspective, those were kids I covered within just the first 10 episodes of the podcast. There have been more, so many more. 11-year-old Logan Klein, 12-year-old Eduardo Paso, 18-year-old Treyana Somerville, 5-year-old Josias Marquez, 12-year-old Max Schollenberger, 5-year-old Lauren McConiel, 3-year-old Scotty McMillan, 10-year-old Zara Baker, 4-year-old Avery Lee Hobbs, 3-year-old Poppy Vandermerve, 4-year-old Samaya Downing, 15-year-old Alex Radita, 6-year-old Corey Michelow, 8-year-old Rika Roundtree, 2-year-old Dante Mullenix, 2-year-old Stephen Meek II, 8-year-old Autumn Hello, 4-year-old Judah Morgan, 7-year-old Shelley Ebony Ward, 2-year-old Derizabel Baez, 4-year-old Tegan Skiba, 4-month-old Sterling Cohen, 11-year-old Heaven Watkins, 3-year-old Teslin Okal, 4-year-old Moko Rangido Hederi, 3-year-old Ronnie Paris, 9-year-old Emric Osuna, 9-month-old Michael Kenzia and his brother, 4-month-old Kevin Kenzia, their older sister, Shane Kenzia, who survived her torture, 5-year-old Garnet Spears, 8-month-old Morgan Reed, 2-year-old Bradley McGee, 5-year-old Callie Anderson, 6-year-old Alexavier Pedrin, 5-year-old Christian Crossland, 5-year-old Alexia Real and her surviving older sister, Jessica Real. For the record, those are just the kids whose treatment definitely fell under that definition of child torture. There are many more whose treatment probably qualified, and who knows how many kids I haven't covered on the podcast who were tortured or still are being tortured. The Administration for Children and Family Services for Survivors of Torture program offers aid to people who have been tortured in other countries and now live in the United States. UNICEF fights against violence against children, but there are no specific humanitarian aid programs in the United States for American children who are victims of child torture. Today's guest, Allie Davis, who survived intrafamilial child torture herself, aims to change that. After this quick sponsor break, you'll hear my conversation with Allie. Hi, Allie. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Me too. I really appreciate you reaching out to me. Once I heard what you're doing, I had to talk to you because it's so important. And like you said, there's so many victims of child torture in this country right now who just aren't getting any kind of aid.
Yep, very much so.
So I guess we should start at the beginning. Would you mind telling us a little about your story and what your childhood experience looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a big question. So I'm just going to kind of give the highlights and then we can dive in depth more later.
Sure.
I grew up in actually Alaska. I'm living in Texas now. Been here about 13 years. And I was a victim of childhood torture by the person who gave birth to me from the age of about 6 months to about 19. It took various forms during that time, which we'll probably get into later, like the different forms. There's physical, there's psychological, there's a lot of different aspects to it. But yeah, that was my upbringing. And, I was an only child. I was homeschooled most of that time as well. And so very isolated. I didn't actually realize that wasn't the norm, or an acceptable experience for a very long time. And even that realization kind of happened in stages. And so it has been a journey, a journey and a half.
So I had read in your article that it had to do, or there was at least some involvement with the Institute for Basic Life Principles. And I really don't know too much about Bill Gothard and the IBLP, but What can you tell us about that and how that was involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So a great resource for folks wanting to learn more about the breadth and depth of how influential his organization has been in what we're currently living through in the US. I would recommend the docuseries Shiny Happy People on Amazon. It came out this summer. But in terms of my experience, I really think that it was a perpetrator that was going to be cruel anyway, who was influenced by teachings that really gave a lot of assistance and encouragement in that direction. One of his great friends was Michael and Debbie Pearl, and they wrote a book that I personally consider to be a childhood torture manual called To Train Up a Child. And it basically talks about how to break the will of a child. And that's one of the things that separates torture from abuse, is that torture is intentional and calculated and done to break the victim.
I like the way you put that, a child torture manual. A lot of times with some of the cases I've covered, I've wondered, how do they all behave so similarly? Is there a manual for these people? It's too prevalent. I mean, I've probably covered about 145 children on the podcast. And I went through and counted, and just off the top of my head, without even digging too deep into the details, at least 45 of them were childhood torture victims. There's no way there's not more of them out there.
Yep. And the fact that there's virtually no help once we do make it out. And on top of that, we're just expected to assimilate into a society that very often celebrates the institutes that are responsible for what we went through. And we're expected to just assimilate right into it like nothing ever happened. And it's so bizarre.
You said you kind of realized in stages that the way your birth organism treated you was not normal. And how did that come about? Or how old were you when you started to realize that?
Of course, as a kid, I kind of went back and forth between this can't be right, like that sense of justice and being like, this can't be right, But then I had no real frame of reference to compare it to. And so over time, I was like, well, I guess this is how things go, And then it's the wildest thing. You know how people jokingly say like, oh, I brought you into this world, I could take you out,
Mm-hmm.
I was probably 25 or 26 before I realized that that's a joke to most people. That's a hyperbole. Like that's like being like, I'm so mad I could kill you, right? Like most people don't mean it when they say that. And most kids don't grow up believing that that is an imminent possibility.
Yeah.
And so that realization was a huge shock. And I think that kind of propelled, a lot of my, okay, let me figure out like what else was like that, what else did I just have the assumption was completely normal and okay that other people very much did not. I also, around 2020, I had been in therapy for about a year. And I saw a post about blanket training, which anyone who's watched the docuseries will be very familiar with that. And it just, like everything cascaded into my brain at once. And I was like, oh, like, no, this wasn't okay. And I just started seeing everything in a whole new light. And that was like my first inkling that like there were probably other people out there with similar stories.
Sure, yeah. And do you want to talk for a second about what blanket training is for anyone who hasn't watched the docuseries yet? I did read up on it a little bit, and it is, I don't even want to say disgusting, but that is one good word for it.
Yes, exactly. And I think they did a really good job in that docuseries of not sensationalizing things in a way that's gross to the survivors, which I really appreciated. But so for those unfamiliar, blanket training is when and this is a technique that was championed by Michael and Debbie Pearl and, endorsed by Gothard. So blanket training is when you take a literal infant, usually less than 6 months, but definitely less than 12, and you put them on a baby blanket, a small blanket, and you put a toy or an object that they really, really want and are super interested in, and you set it on the floor off of the blanket, but close enough that they can still see it and reach for it. And then you hit them every time they reach for it until they stop reaching for it.
nothing could really encapsulate breaking the child's spirit better than that.
Exactly. And, some people look at that and go, oh yeah, that's abusive. No, it's torture because you're setting them up. You're manipulating the situation. You're literally setting a trap and slamming it shut on them.
Yeah, you're teaching them what you want doesn't matter. You're just going to get hurt.
Yep, exactly. And from such a young age, like less than 6 months old, like they don't even understand what they're doing at that point.
That's just so upsetting. And for that to be a parenting technique, it's awful. So you grew up in that type of environment where anything that you did was basically wrong.
Yep. Always, always, always wrong. Always something wrong with it. Even if you do the right thing and you do it with quote unquote the wrong attitude, which can be exemplified just by having a heavy sigh because your feet are hurting. Like that's the wrong attitude. And that is just as deserving of punishment as disobeying in the first place.
Yeah. And so you would be forced to do the most nonsensical things. So you were forced to do basically exercise or manual labor. Was that a punishment or was that just something you had to do because that was her whim?
It was both. So the pointless labor was punishment. The productive labor was, it was framed as chores, which to be clear, there's nothing wrong with like age appropriate teaching a child how we take care of the space that we live in with other people, But there's a very big difference between, a kid helping set the table and clear the table versus you're responsible at, 10 for washing all of the dishes. And if you leave a crumb on a dish, now your perpetrator is taking all the dishes out of the cabinets and now you're staying up until 11 o'clock that night washing all the dishes again and then having to go write an essay about laziness and why that makes you a sinner. And, big difference.
Yeah, no doubt. What kind of pointless chores would she have you do? I mean, I read about it in your article and it gave me chills and it's giving me chills now just thinking about it. But for anyone who hasn't read it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the ones that I remember the most, and I actually have a photograph of this because that was part of the psychological torture, which was basically causing a meltdown and then making me go look in the mirror or taking a photograph of it. And, this was back in the 90s and early 2000s. Like we had to send these pictures off to the grocery store and wait for them to come back,
Yep.
And then when they came back in, even if we were having a good day, this whole production would be made of, making me come over and look at the photos and see, basically what a horrible person I was, right? For having a meltdown and a bad look on my face.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the picture that I actually have is digging up. So we lived on 2 acres of pretty undeveloped land up in Alaska. So that particular chore was going outside and digging up large rocks, like not boulder size, but like large, heavy rocks, and then carrying them like from one side of the yard and making a pile. And then, okay, now you did that. Okay, now carry them over to the other side. Like for why? Because I can make you.
Why not?
Right, exactly. Not allowed to come inside until it was done. Thankfully, I did have like a hose out there for water, but not a good situation.
No. So she withheld food and water and that sort of thing as punishment or held it over your head as well.
Oh yeah, always. And that's one of the things that differentiates abuse from torture is that perpetrators of torture leverage their victims' access to the basic necessities of life, breathing, food, water, sleep, hygiene, all of those things.
That does things to a child's developing brain that we can't even really measure, I would guess. And I doubt there's been enough studies on how much this does affect kids.
Oh, yeah. There's been no studies. If I'm wrong, someone please email me the study. But I can't find a single study. The closest that we have is an article from 2014 in the Journal of Child and Adolescent Trauma that basically it just proposes a medical definition for non-war related childhood torture, because that's part of the problem is when there's no definition, then we can't study it. We can't legislate it. We can't treat it. And so, even that article, which is a great article, it's very important. All it really does is propose a definition. And when you look at the section on long-term health outcomes, that wasn't the focus of the study. And so it's basically a paragraph that says PTSD is the most common currently known outcome for these survivors. But like, if we look at other torture survivors, we know there's a whole host of physical and mental health problems beyond PTSD that sometimes people deal with their whole lives.
I'll link that article in the show notes for this episode because I did read that myself, and I'm glad there's at least a proposed definition, but the fact that no one has settled on one or necessarily even made an effort to make sure that that definition is universal or even used in law, because state to state, the definition of torture, I've seen it many times get argued over in court because, you know, this person's charged with torture. Well, what is the meaning of torture? And that's really unacceptable. It shouldn't be up in the air. That's something that should be pretty solid by this point, I would think.
Absolutely. It is not a new concept. It is not a new concept at all. And I think really the biggest hurdle is people don't want to wrap their minds around the fact that people will do this to their own offspring or to a child in their care.
1,000%.
Mm-hmm. It's really traumatizing for people to process that. And they would rather consider the high profile cases that do make the news as a one-off, you know, once in a generation. What a monster. We can't possibly imagine it. And that really does a disservice to the thousands of others for every one people hear about.
Exactly. And that's why this podcast exists, because no one wanted to talk about the kids' cases. No one wants to hear about it. I have a very solid listener base, but I've seen people trying to recommend the podcast to someone, say on Reddit, when I'm just kind of lurking around out there. Most people will respond, "Oh, I can't handle that. Nope."
Yep.
And I understand that. You know, I'm certainly not expecting to make a whole bunch of money doing this. I'm in it because I really need people to understand that, and I'll never stop repeating this statistic until it changes, that 4 to 7 kids in the U.S. alone every single day are dying from abuse and neglect. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that it does exist so often, that's why I tell the kids stories who really don't get a lot of mainstream attention. Most of the kids that I talk about, maybe a couple local news stories and this and that, but it's just like, well, who is this child? You know, I've never seen their face on the news before. And that's why we're talking about them.
They're just forgotten and their stories matter.
Exactly.
36% child torture has a known fatality rate of 36%. And my personal hunch is that it's much higher than that because the extreme isolation that it tends to occur in gives a lot of opportunity for just undocumented deaths.
Right. Sure.
Another really important statistic along those lines is 55 children go missing from foster care every single day.
Yeah, that's just too much. There's so much broken in the child welfare system, well, everywhere in the world, but let's start here. I'll pause here for a word from my sponsors. Is your abuser still alive?
Yep.
I would imagine you don't have contact.
I did for a very long time. 2020 was actually when I went ahead and cut contact. Unfortunately, I did become extremely enmeshed with her because, you know, again, very isolated. So it took a while to be able to recognize it as not okay, not healthy, and then build the courage to, you know, like set the boundary and, you know, make that decision.
Congratulations on that. And that is, you know, setting the boundary. It's got to tear you apart from the inside out.
Yeah, it was extremely hard. Some of the worst months of my life followed that, but then on the other side, some of the best years of my life. So I'm very grateful.
So it was worth it, and that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
You seem like such a happy person, and I'm sure that you have your dark moments and that you've gone through hell and back, but the fact that you can find humor in any of it is encouraging.
Thank you. I cope with humor and sarcasm.
I feel that in my soul. Yeah, sometimes you have to. Have you ever thought about writing a book?
I have. And a lot of people have asked me that. I probably will eventually. But right now I am really, really focusing on securing humanitarian aid of some kind for survivors because we have horrible outcomes. Like, remember in May of 2020 when everyone was losing their minds because of the economy and the unemployment rate was 13.3% in the US? People with a ACE score, which for those unfamiliar, adverse childhood experiences, it ranges 0 to 10. people with an ACE score of 4 or higher have an unemployment rate of 13.2%.
All the time.
All the time. And that's from a study back in, I believe, 2001 or 2011. So like, we don't have updated statistics to point to, but like, that's huge. And we have extremely high healthcare costs as well. And so coupled with unemployment and underemployment, we have really bad life outcomes. And I wish I had a statistic to point to explain all of the life outcomes that we have, but nobody's researching it yet.
Wow. That's wild. There's some of the things that people are researching out there make you scratch your head why something this important wouldn't be studied.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. Took the words right out of my mouth. It keeps me up nights.
We already know that there's a very high prevalence of mental illness amongst unhoused individuals and things like that. So you can see how trauma would affect someone and would prevent them from being able to, to use the parlance, live their best life. How could they?
Exactly. We have extremely high rates. Everything that I'm saying right now is based on my own personal experiences and conversation with other survivors. I am very cautious and intentional about how I quote information because we, as a society, just need to get better at our information literacy. So right. I want to be very clear that what I'm saying right now is not research-based, but only because there is no research. But we have very high rates of suicide. We have very high rates of homelessness. We have extremely high rates of trafficking. We have extremely high rates of substance use and overdose. We're not okay.
I mean, how could you be, especially without enough resources to get the help you need?
Exactly. And if you look at, this is the thing that is so baffling to me, right? I specify that it's non-war related because when people hear torture, they automatically think war. And that's understandable because it certainly does happen in that setting. However,
there's this whole other side of it.
And it's just so mind-boggling to me how I'm so glad that the resources are there for people who survive torture, outside of the US, as well as, POWs and all of these things, right? It's very important and they probably need more resources than they have. But it's wild to me that there's absolutely no resources for us because when you look at war related, hey, if we want to look at war, let's look at war. In the US, people in the military who are at high risk for capture and interrogation go through training to help them learn how to withstand torture. And they still come back with massive, massive physical and mental health issues if they are captured and tortured. How on earth do we expect a literal child who goes through this from the people who are supposed to take care of them and protect them with no training on how to cope with it, and then turn them out into the world with no support and expect anything more than what we're getting?
Yeah, that makes no sense at all. I mean, of course, you can't train children how to withstand torture, but right. If that's their entire life, that's all they know. And then all of a sudden, here, live a life and be normal.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
How do you do that?
It's mind-boggling.
How did you decide to launch this initiative and the Pretty Graffiti Foundation?
Sometimes I still can't believe I'm doing this because I've been in healthcare for over 15 years. I've had friends who've started nonprofits and I'm very familiar with the industry. I've volunteered for nonprofits before and I had no intention of ever getting involved in that world. And when I had the realization that what I had been through was torture and not in fact abuse, I was like, oh, awesome. I have a name for it, right? I'm very big on labels to the extent that they help us understand our experience, right? And so I was like, cool, torture. Let's get to Googling. There's gotta be some resources. There's gotta be a therapist directory. There's gotta be a support group. There's gotta be something, right? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Everything that is out there from the UN and the Department of Health and Human Services, because they do have substantial humanitarian aid packages for torture survivors. And I was like, yay, jackpot, found it. Gonna use these resources for myself and share them with, the other survivors I know. Started looking into the programs and every single one of them, the criteria for who they serve is either people who were tortured outside the US and are now living here or people who were victims of state-sanctioned torture. And like I said earlier, I'm very glad those resources exist, but it excludes us. And so I was like, well, okay, nobody's doing anything. All right. And then I started getting into the research a little bit more. And when I learned the fatality rate, how common it actually is, and the economic outcomes, I was like, well, somebody needs to do something. So here we go.
So that's it. Jump in with both feet and that's it.
Pretty much. Yeah. So I'm a very let's get it done person,
Yeah, I guess so. Well, that's good. I mean, the world needs more of those, that's for sure. And I saw, some of the art that you've made. How did you start making this beautiful, meaningful art that's based on these powerful quotes? And it's obviously so personal to you.
Thank you so much. So it still makes me I don't know, so anxious when people compliment my art, because I was not an artist growing up. One of the things about growing up in childhood torture is you never know what's going to be, I like to call them a load-bearing rule, right? So a lot of parents will say things to their kids just goofy things. I saw one the other night, a meme that was going around Facebook, and this person had little kids, probably 6 and 7, in these little pajamas that had glow in the dark dinosaurs or something on them. And the kids were laying on the floor in their room under the light, and they were clearly happy and fine. And the person was like, yeah, I told my kids that their glow-in-the-dark pajamas can only charge if they lay still under the bedroom light, and it bought me 20 minutes of peace before bedtime, right?
Oh.
And parents do silly little things like that in the overall picture of a healthy childhood are not necessarily detrimental, right?
Oh my God, I have to tell you one. My kids are 19 and 16 now, but they still talk about this. I used to tell them that if they ate their pork chops, they would get X-ray vision.
Exactly. And so, in the context of a healthy, happy childhood, it's not that big of a deal if a kid is 20 when they go, wait a minute, that's not how that works,
I can't see through the wall, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. But when you're in the context of childhood torture and you're well, I guess this is how the world, you don't even question it. You don't even, And so I still remember this very clearly. I was about 5 and I was coloring. I had just gotten one of those 64-pack crayons that everybody wanted.
Oh yeah, with the sharpener in the back.
Yep, with the sharpener in the back. And I went to use it and she yelled at me and was like, no, you have to figure it out. You have to figure out how to sharpen it without the sharpener. And then showed me how to peel the paper back and color it down to make a point, So I just never sharpened my crayons after that, because I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's a rule. I have no idea if I would have sharpened them, if it would have been no big deal, if she was just trying to show me something cool, or if she was trying to make art difficult. I don't know. But a bunch of little things like that kind of added up to where I never considered myself an artist. And I was very self-conscious about any artistic endeavors. And I've also always been very, I am a words person. I love quotes. That's my jam. And a couple of years ago, I was watching Hannah Gadsby's Nanette on Netflix for the 50th time. In that show, there is a quote by Picasso that each time I leave a woman, I should burn her, destroy the woman, destroy the past she represents. Regarding his relationship with a 17-year-old girl when he was in his late 40s.
Wow, that's dark.
Yeah, I'm using relationship very, very loosely there for...
Yeah, another air quote moment.
Yes, exactly. And then Hannah goes on and is explaining their own experience with, childhood sexual abuse, which is something I also went through outside of the home, outside of the family, but it definitely added on some, levels of trauma. And Hannah went on to say, to be rendered powerless does not destroy your humanity. Your resilience is your humanity. And that's one of my favorite quotes from the show. And for some reason that night after I heard it, I just paused everything. I shut the TV off and I sat down with a canvas and I did not know what I was making. I was having one of those nights where I just hoped I would make it to the next day. And I sat down with the canvas and I just scrawled that quote from Picasso on there. And I just got in that artist flow, and when I was done, I had this beautiful canvas that has Picasso's quote in the background, but you can't really read it unless you know it's there. And it has this inspiring quote from a queer trauma survivor on top of it. And the process of like that reclamation was so moving to me that I went and got like 30 more canvases and
wow.
did the same thing with so many different quotes. And now pieces from that first collection have homes on the East Coast, on the West Coast, and here. And every year I do a different medium. So this year my collection is upcycled cosmetics. That's what I actually color the canvas with. A good friend of mine owns a cosmetics company, and I purchased cosmetics waste from them and used that to put like the background quote on the canvas and like cover it up. And then the new quote on top, I embroidered directly onto the canvas.
Oh, that's cool.
Oh my God. It's amazing. I was so sore after I was done making those 3 pieces. It took me so long. And the reason, so I named my art style Pretty Graffiti, and that's what led into the Pretty Graffiti Foundation, because I really want to change the art world and how we collect art and how we compensate artists. And so a portion of every art sale gets donated to PGF. And I also increase the price, and I always set the price based on, I call it like oppression by the numbers. So I did a piece with a Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote, and it was $110 because out of 115 Supreme Court justices at the time, 110 had been men. And so every price is different, and it's chosen based on something like that I want to highlight and like educate people about.
That's really cool that it doesn't have to be about just one thing. People need to learn much more about many topics. And I really like that.
Thank you. We need to really just move beyond this like binary, like I can only hold one concept in my brain at any given time. Like,
yeah. I can't even tell you how hard I rail against black and white thinking and that sort of thing. It's just, come on, open your mind a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So you also gather funding through grants and individual donors, but how else can we help? How can people help you further this cause? It's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are still working towards our 501c3 status right now. Our board is mostly survivors, some of child torture, some of other life things that aren't mine to disclose. So we have to work at our own pace so that we don't burn out, because this is a very long haul, long vision thing. So with that being said, we're currently operating at a budget of $6.58 per program recipient, and we've already launched 2 aid programs. One is we sent out handwritten love letters and embroidered affirmation cards to survivors who requested them for Valentine's Day.
Oh, I love that.
It was really fun. And then we also just launched our Shop Survivor Owned initiative. So on our website, there's a tab, Shop Survivor Owned, and survivors who have a business, whether it's an Etsy store, whether it's adult entertainment, whether it's a book that they've written, consulting, but like whatever it is, they can send us their link and we put it up there under the appropriate category, and people can shop survivor owned and support a survivor owned business so that we can support ourselves.
Oh, that's great. Okay, that's a great idea.
Yeah, and it's a great way for people who don't have the money right now to support us financially, like to still contribute. You know, if you're looking for a new book to read or you're looking for some art for your wall, buy it from a survivor. Like if it's something you're already going to buy anyway, buy it from a survivor. And that has so much impact. So in the future, we have plans for, we'll be launching a harm reduction program this fall in conjunction with overdose awareness or overdose prevention. I forget which one. But August 31st, it's Overdose Prevention Day, I believe. So we're going to be launching that. We've got a Life Skills University that's about to drop in March, teaching survivors about, you know, just how to do basic life skills. And then in the future, we'll be, you know, doing like some pretty serious fundraising for healthcare costs, housing assistance, those types of things.
Okay, so we'll just keep an eye on your website and your social media, and I'll include all those links in the show notes too, so that everyone can find it and follow it. Now for one more quick sponsor break. Now, before we go, I definitely want to talk about your article your love of true crime is not more important than trauma survivors' agency over our own stories.
Yes.
I got a chill as soon as I saw that, and I couldn't click fast enough. Over the past 4 years, I have done a number of stories of kids without talking to their families.
Yeah.
And just last fall, I had one in particular request to remove a story. Mm-hmm. I don't get them often. Mm-hmm. But the surviving sisters of a little boy reached out to me, and they were upset that I had covered the story. And I felt terrible. Just the thought that I could have re-traumatized these girls who are now, one of them's an adult, but it tore my heart out. I had to take a break from the podcast for about 3 months, and that was a huge contributing factor to it. Yeah. The guilt and just it wreaked havoc on my mental health. And I can't stress enough how important it is that as quote unquote true crime content creators, that we are ethical about this and that we include the family members, that we include the survivors if they survived, that we include the people whose voices need to be heard. There's a lot of people who make this kind of content just for money. That's it. Or, for clicks, for likes, for whatever. And that can't be what this is. That's not ever what it's been about for me. So I didn't have that additional layer of guilt, but definitely it exists, and the families have to be involved. We have to try harder.
Mm-hmm. I agree wholeheartedly. I always say there's a respectful way to engage with true crime, and there's a creepy way to engage with true crime.
Yes. And it's a lot easier to find the latter than the former.
Yes, very much so, unfortunately.
It really, it can be so ghoulish sometimes. And I know people don't like to hear the details of a child's murder or whatever. Obviously, who wants to hear that? But at the same time, there's a way to do it respectfully, and there's a way not to. Not making it sensationalist is the utmost importance, but also hearing the families' voices, hearing the voices of the people who actually went through this is so, so important.
It's extremely important. I hope someday through my organization to put together like a responsible journalism or responsible reporting training for journalists to learn how to do better when reporting on these stories, because I think it is important that they be reported on, but the way that it's happening leaves a lot to be desired from a survivor standpoint.
Yeah, I bet. I was just talking with a mom this morning. She was saying that, the way that some of the news organizations, and these are large regional news organizations, the way they worded some of these details, yeah, it was pretty well true, but just the way you word things is so important in what sticks in people's minds and what they actually retain from these stories and information. And it is so important. So I think, professional journalists still need training on this sort of thing, let alone podcasters like myself. I mean, who the hell am I, honestly? Just some lady who's like, oh, you know what? I'm going to start a blog. I had some form of, imposter syndrome going on after hearing from those girls last year. It just, who am I? If I'm going to do this for all the right reasons, I hope, then I better do it right. That's how I feel about the whole thing. And I think everyone needs to have the same mindset. If, not to say I'm right about everything. God, I know that's not true, but just at least that we all kind of come together and understand, like you said, what the ethical way is to do this, and how to be sensitive to the survivors and the victims' families and all of that.
Absolutely. And, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially as I've, started telling my story more publicly and whatnot. And storytelling is an important skill in our society. Just as humans, we've been telling stories for millennia. And I think if we approach it from that angle of like everyone's story has value, and some people are more skilled at storytelling, than others. Like we all have different strengths and skills and whatnot. And for the consumers to be respectful and humble about it, of like, we're witnesses to these people's stories. Like that's a human drive to have someone witness your existence or your story. And I think that framework could take us a very long way.
Right. One of these family members started an initiative that was engage with empathy. And that if that was the mindset that we all went into this with, either creating the content or consuming the content, yes, I think that would make such a huge difference.
Absolutely. I agree. And the other thing too that I want to kind of increase awareness about is like, obviously the priority is the safety and well-being of the individual survivor whose story is being told. Or if the person whose story is being told is no longer with us, the the safety and well-being also of, their loved ones, right? But I think it's also important for people to consider how people completely disconnected from the particular story being told are impacted by the way those stories are told. I remember when I was pretty early on in figuring out what had happened to me, and there was a couple of high-profile cases that hit the news, and oh my God, if I hear one more reporter call these crimes unimaginable, I'm going to yell. It's not unimaginable. Someone imagined it and someone did it. A lot of people,
Yeah, try to imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think being mindful also of how it's going to affect other people with similar stories is also really, really important.
Yeah, you're right. I'm positive that word has wormed its way into multiple episodes of mine, and I'm going to be more mindful of that in particular. It's hard to come up with enough adjectives for some of these crimes or some of these terrible people, but it's so important to use the right ones. And my storytelling ability is one of the things that I feel fairly confident in, but I don't feel as if I am at the peak of my abilities. I can always learn and change. And I like to think that when necessary, I've been able to do that. So thank you for that, for pointing out that even that one small thing.
I think it's very important for us to all always be open to learning and growing and changing. I mean, I think once we think that we've reached the point where we don't need to learn anymore, that's when we're in trouble,
Yeah, that's time to give up.
Yes, exactly. Just pack it up.
I really appreciate the insights that I've learned from you, and what you're doing is so important. And thank you for all of this, for putting this all together and sharing it with the world and being so brave to tell people your story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for everything you do. It's important.
Well, I just hope that I'm doing it right. That's all that matters to me. If I can do it respectfully and empathetically, then I can sleep at night, I think. Mm-hmm. Maybe.
Some nights.
Yeah. Huge thank you to Allie for everything she's doing. I'll include all relevant links to Allie's content and resources in the show notes for this episode. Remember, if you see or suspect a child is being abused or tortured, please say something. And if you have kids of your own, give them extra hugs tonight. Now, time for a couple quick patron shout-outs. Thank you to my newest patrons, Zoe S. from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Sasha H. from Bussum, the Netherlands. I've made some changes to my Patreon tiers, which you can check out at patreon.com/stlcpod. Thank you to all of my supporters. That's it for this episode. Join me next time for another child's story. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/stlcpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Laine. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.